Hi, I'm Bill Bosch. We called him terrible names. I called him terrible names. Small-minded, little, ugly names. I suppose we did that because we were young. I know that we were stupid. I know that I was afraid. Now, you have to step back for a moment because this was many years ago when I was 12 and 13 and 14 years old, and the concept of political correctness had never been invented. And as I look back now, I think that my whole entire life was a large ball of political incorrectness. I grew up in this big Irish Catholic family. I had 19 uncles and boy cousins. We were even conservative about our naming. There were 4 Bills. There were 2 Bobs. There were 3 Jimmys. There were 3 Richards. My uncles never belonged to a country club. I don't think they ever touched a golf club at all or a tennis racket. They belonged to the Elks and the Lions and the Kiwanis and the Knights of Columbus. Their major sports were poker and whiskey and beer. Among my friends, we lived in a kind of a world separate from adults. And so we would be out on our own in the neighborhood where we lived. In fact, in the summertime, my mother would always lock the door and not allow us to come back into the house. I have to go to the bathroom. All right, go to the bathroom. Now you're back outside. What my friends and I like to do mostly in this little cadre of 12, 13, 14-year-old boys is that we like to break into things. We used to like to break into places. And so we'd break into the local lumber company, and we used to get planks, and we'd ride on the little roller coaster conveyor belt because it was fun. We'd break into any new house that was being built anywhere around our neighborhoods. We didn't vandalize or damage anything, but we just liked the idea of breaking into somewhere. There was this very awesome private park enclave. It was called Clemson Park. It was about 30 acres with only 5 houses, and we would always break in there in the winter to sled ride, but we'd break in there in the summer because someone in the 1920s had built a Japanese garden and transported things from Japan, and we would just walk over the arched bridge and we'd sit in the pagoda as if we were in some other world. We used to jump over the fence at the local pool and we'd swim late at night. In fact, I lived near a large park, and we were kind of on the edge of town, and there was a forest beyond it. The railroad tracks came in there, and there was a large curve. And when that curve occurred, hobos would jump off the train and go back into this large forested park. And we'd love to go back in there in the early evening and see if we could see their lights off in the distance. And if they had left, we'd come to see how they lived. We were kind of like urban archaeologists. We didn't know what they were actually up to. One of my friends, his favorite pastime was lighting fires. He would set things on fire anywhere that he could. And we played baseball in the sand lot, and we'd hang out, and, we had the typical Irish bully who lived in the neighborhood. I still remember his name, Bobby Connolly. He was about 5 years older than us, and, he'd come where we were playing baseball, and he'd take our ball and steal it, or he'd take our mitts from us and he'd spit in the glove. And every once in a while, when he was feeling really mean and ugly, he'd take our bats and he'd throw them in the opposite direction from where we were going home. But sometimes he'd take the damn bat and he'd throw it in the pond, and one of us would have to go into the pond to get it. And that went on for quite a while until one day my father had had enough, and he drove around in the car and he found Bobby Connolly, and I sat in the car as he basically picked him up by the scruff of his neck and shook him like you would shake something. And I was still petrified of Bobby Conley, but he never bothered me again. When we would choose up sides, we would say 1 potato, 2 potato, 3 potato, 4, 5 potato, 6 potato. Everybody knows that one. But we also would say eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catcha. Now, if you don't know the next line of that, good for you. And if you do, I'm not going to say it here. But the name calling occurred in a very specific time and place. We used to have to walk to school. I went to the public school first, and then I went to the Irish Catholic school. You know, in my neighborhood, everybody was named Osborne and Hogan, and there were 2 Catholic schools in town, 2 elementary schools, and one, apparently, unbeknownst to me, was for the Irish. And the other one on the other side of town, my mother would refer to, oh, that's where the Italians go. And so we'd walk to school. We'd go down Winchester Avenue, and then we'd go on Columbia, and Lake Avenue was a little bit long, and then a few more blocks to where we'd either go to school or get the bus. Only when I was very, very little, maybe kindergarten, first grade, do I remember a mom walking with us on that trip. But shortly after that, we walked by ourselves. As we continued to go down the street, we would just accumulate more of my little ruffian friends. You know, we were a little more Bowery boys than we were little rascals. But on our way home, we would pass by Lake Avenue, which was a long street, and we'd pass a particular house where there was a man who was obviously disabled. Now, oftentimes, we would not see him because he wasn't in the yard, but every once in a while he was in the yard. And when we crossed in front of his house, we would call him these terrible names. So we would start out with something like, stupid! Then someone would say, retard! And we had our own little private name for him. And we called him Hunga Bunga. And someone ultimately would say, Hunga Bunga! And when that happened, he would chase us. And it was a strange dance that occurred because we would scream and we would run and he would chase us, and he was large and he looked very, very strange to us, and he was lumbering and he was huge and he was scary, and we would run past his yard, and right at the end of his particular house there was a stream with a bridge that both cars and people could walk over. Someone had taught him to not go beyond his own yard. And so once we got over that bridge, we were safe. And we would be huffing and puffing and breathing hard, and we would look back, and he would be there at the edge of his yard, and sometimes we would still continue to catcall at him. Well, one time I remember his mother appeared on the front porch, and she yelled at us. She said, "Why are you yelling at my son? Why are you calling him those names? He's never hurt you. He's never bothered you. Stop it. You should be ashamed." And I was, but just a little. That went on for several years. And then one day, sitting in the kitchen in my house, my mother sitting at the kitchen table reading the evening news, because there were 2 papers in my little city. I used to actually deliver the evening news. She said, "Oh, you know that disabled boy down on Lake Avenue?" She said, "You know who I'm talking about." And I said, "Who?" And she said, "You know exactly who I mean. Just over the brook, just over where the bridge is." She said, "You know him." And I turned to her and I said, "Hunga Bunga?" And she gave me a mother's look that said, "You have stepped way over any bounds. You are so wrong and so bad." She said his name was Stephen. I stopped and I thought to myself, Hunga Bunga was Stephen? His name was Stephen? He was someone's Stephen? And I looked at her and she said, "He died." Stephen died? She said, "Yes, he was very young." I said, "Stephen died?" And she said, "He was 27. I said, 27? he was some mom's Stephen, and he was 27, and he died. And she said, you know, young people with Down syndrome, they don't live very long. And at that moment, at that juncture in time, I realized that my voice, finding my voice throughout all that early childhood, had been used to hurt him, to make every day a little bit less for him, to hurt his mom, and to make him sad. And I vowed that day that I would not use my voice that way, that I would not be quite so stupid, that I would try to be less afraid. And I believe that on that day, I found not only my voice, but my heart as well. Thank you.